Hi there, Elise Dewsberry here with the 46th installment of my vlog, How to Get No Feedback from Elise. And today I want to talk about statement of fact versus interaction or other things that aren't statements of fact. There's two different ways that I want to approach this. There's the use of a statement of fact in an outline, and there's the use of a statement of fact as part of dialogue. And there are issues with both of them, so I want to talk about it. So let me start with dialogue because I think it's a little bit easier to understand. So when you're writing dialogue for a character, I'll give you one example of a statement of fact, and I'll explain to you why I think that's what it is. So an example is, a year ago, my father was murdered by a terrorist while he was working as a journalist in the Middle East. That was a line of dialogue that someone used in a play that in a musical that I was reviewing not too long ago. Now, nothing wrong with the information in that sentence, but I read that as a statement of fact because there is no character there. There's no sense of what is the age of this person, what is the education of this person, how does this person, most importantly, how does this person feel about this? Now, one could assume that if your father was murdered, you would be upset about it, but that isn't necessarily true, and not all statements of fact are as clear-cut as that. So there's no character in there. There's nothing in there to define that character, to help us understand who that character is, what kind of a person they are, and how they're feeling about the facts that they are telling us at the moment. So when you talk about character diction, what you want to do is make sure that you aren't simply writing a sentence that is subject, object, verb, state something that is fact, and put no point of view, no character, no emotion, no feeling, no, not even a regionalism, a stutter, a grammatical eccentricity, anything that will make your character more interesting. You have to, as the writer of the dialogue in a musical, because you have so little. This is really important because the songs are using up so much time. You don't get a lot of time, and that means you cannot waste a syllable of what your characters are speaking as a dialogue. You need to advance the plot, and illuminate character simultaneously with every word that you write. So you have to think really hard, and you need to make sure that you never simply write a statement of fact, that you always infuse it with character, with emotion, with information about your character, because you've got to do double duty. You can't just state fact. So that's in dialogue. That has to do with character diction, defining your characters through their diction. The other way that I think about a statement of fact is if you're writing an outline. Often people work with me on outlines before they move on to write their full show, and any of you have gone through that process with me know that I'm particularly picky about the language of an outline, and I've had past vlogs where I've discussed this, but I wanted to discuss this one particular aspect of it. In your outline, if you state a fact, that is more, I think of that a little bit more in the legal sense. I would, as an attorney, I would jump up and say, I object, that's a statement of fact, not in evidence. In an outline, this is very important. For instance, in your outline, you say, Joe enters the room, he is a tennis player. Well, the statement, he is a tennis player, is a statement of facts, not in evidence. Because when you're writing an outline, you are trying to write what your audience will see and hear. So if I'm sitting in the audience and somebody walks in, how will I know he's a tennis player? If you write the words, he is a tennis player, in your outline, you have tried to convince yourself that your job is done. You have made it clear that this person who just walked in is a tennis player. I beg to differ. I say that in your outline, you have not given your audience that information. You've just had someone walk in. I don't know that they're a tennis player. If they walk in and someone who's already in the room says, oh, look, it's that tennis player we saw last week, that's pretty heavy-handed. I'm not a book writer. But then I will know. So in your outline, you would say, Joe walks into the room. One of the people in the crowd recognizes him as the famous tennis player who just won Wimbledon yesterday. That is language you could use in an outline because because that is something that the audience will now know. But if you simply state the fact, he is a tennis player, you have not done your job, because that fact is not in evidence to the audience who's looking. So when you submit an outline to me, if anytime that you state a fact without explaining to me how I as an audience member will know that fact. Now, granted, if you say something like Joe walks into the room, he's a redhead, well, I'm going to accept that that's a statement of fact that is in evidence, because clearly, it's important to you, so your production team is going to make sure that he's a redhead if it's important to your show. But there are many other things that I can tell by reading them are not going to be apparent. By he's bent over, he's limping. There are plenty of things you could say that would be clear to me as an audience member. It's like Joe walks in, he's limping. You can say that in your outline because I can see that. But Joe walks in, he's a tennis player. Unless the simple fix would be he's carrying a tennis racket, and at least then there's a hope. I may not 100% know for sure he's a tennis player, but it's certainly likely if he walks in carrying a tennis racket. So that may seem really silly, the difference between saying Joe walks in, he's carrying a tennis racket versus Joe walks in, he is a tennis player. That's a simplistic explanation. This comes into play when things get more complicated than whether or not someone is a tennis player, but the same concept applies. You never want to simply state a fact in your outline. You want to state what your audience can see and hear in the kind of outline I'm talking about. Outline, synopsis, there are many different definitions of these words, but when I talk about an outline, I'm talking about a blueprint that you will later be able to use to construct the scene. And so you need to understand those details. So when you sit down to write the scene, and you know that the audience is supposed to know he's a tennis player, if all your outline says is he is a tennis player, when you sit down to write the scene, you're going to go, I need them to know he's a tennis player. How am I going to do that? Because you haven't done your work and clarified that in your outline. If in your outline you wrote, Joe walks in, he's carrying a tennis racket, then when you sit down to write the scene, job done. You've already told the audience what you need to tell them. So a simplistic explanation, a simplistic example that can represent many much more complex and difficult examples in an outline. So whether you're writing an outline or you're writing dialogue, statements of fact just are not useful. They don't tell me how you're going to how you're going to get the information across to the audience in an outline, and they give me no further insight into your character in dialogue. So get rid of the statements of fact and think about more interesting ways to write. Okay? That's it for today. Thank you very much, and toodaloo.